Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
I'm your co-host, Rich Gear, with you. And today, Doug, I'm really kind of excited about this. It's a book we're going to talk about by Jerry Bergman called The Dark Side of Charles Darwin.
Yes, and we were able to obtain a number of copies of this book because he's a personal friend of ours, and he's a co-author of Persuaded by the Evidence as well. And so he of course has written a whole scat of books, and like
this guy is amazing. Jerry to me he's a true scholar in every sense of the word. We've talked about him many times in the past, but it's always good to kind of refresh our audience's memory if they haven't seen the show before. This is a man who's got, what, 9 postgraduate degrees, Doug?
He's got 9 degrees.
9 degrees totally. Okay, 9 degrees. Yeah.
2 bachelor's degrees, 5 master's degrees, and 2 PhDs.
Yeah, he would have had 4 PhDs. I think he didn't get the last 2 because he came out of the closet as a creationist. But that's because he has the credentials to actually have 2 more PhDs. That's how much of a scholar. He's got a library in his house, Doug. When we were there that one time, I'm still
40,000 volumes.
40,000 volumes. It's just an unbelievable. And this guy writes. I don't know how he's so well organized and so put together as far as it goes. But anyway, Doug, when I was reading this book, I was really fascinated by it. Some of the stuff I kind of knew about, like some of his illnesses, but I had no idea the depth of them. And I don't know, where do you want to start as far as talking about this book? You know.
Well, of course, he first gets into the philosophical problems with evolution and Darwin, but then he explores a little bit of Darwin's past, his lineage, his grandfather and his father, and his wife Emma, and their relationships, and what went into the whole life of Charles Darwin, and how he made the decisions that he did. And what caused him to abandon God as a philosophy. I was interested to see that originally he was very impressed with Paley's natural theology argument.
Yes, he was. His argument from design.
And he actually mentions that, I believe, in his Origin of Species book. But he believed that natural selection explained it away. And of course, it really doesn't. And
we know that now.
And we know that now. But it was something that he thought that he had an answer for. And it was interesting also that at the beginning of his voyage on the Beagle, he was actually interested in Christianizing the Fuegans who lived in the Tierra del Fuego of the South America. But he was also expressing some doubts about their humanity because they appeared to be so savage to him.
Right.
Such a
now this was when he was on the Beagle, he was even at that early stage. It's kind of interesting, Doug, because when you look at Charles Darwin, I mean, he is lionized as like people. He's one of the few scientists, pretty much. I think even the average guy would know who Charles Darwin is. In fact, can you think of any other scientist that is so well known as Charles Darwin? I can't think of one. Okay, and quite frankly, he was not. I don't know whether he would have been considered a scientist at the time. He actually, his degree was in theology. Yeah.
He was going to be a country parson as well.
Right, and he was more of a naturalist. But what he did was very scientific in the things, and he loved geology. He wrote as much on geology as he did on biology, I think, in a lot of respects. But it was interesting to think about, Doug, that this man who defended biblical Christianity, at least at the outset, yet the origins, when you talk about his grandfather Erasmus and his father Robert, they were free thinkers, and really Zoonomia, he kind of... Charles Darwin, I'm sorry, in a lot of respects, seems like he plagiarized a lot of ideas that pre-existed him. And Jerry talks about a lot of that stuff. He quotes a lot of different ideas and personages who came up with really evolutionary ideas first. And in fact, one guy, I can't think of his name now, he actually wrote to him, and he said he was kind of disappointed that Darwin didn't give him any credit for some of the stuff that were actually ideas.
Like Edward Blythe, I think
It was,
Blythe and Wallace and a few of these other.
well, Wallace was not the one. I know Wallace was another one. Yeah, but the point of it is, what's interesting with Darwin is, to me, and Jerry brings this up, is, and you can't prove this thing because obviously the witness is not here. Most of his illnesses, he started coming down with serious illnesses, seem to be of the mental or of the. There don't seem to be physiological reasons for a lot of his problems, and he makes a case. It's circumstantial. I will acknowledge that at the outset, but it's it's interesting. When he came up with his ideas of evolution via natural selection, he even spoke like my theory. He was afraid people were going to get mad at him because he's basically murdering God by his theory. Yeah. Okay, and he knew that's what he was doing. Okay, but his grandfather had already proposed many of the things of evolution in the Zoonomia.
That's right.
His father was a free thinker, yet his wife was a devout Christian, and that's kind of an interesting thing in and of itself. And you wonder if he fought. Jerry talks about that. I always wondered, he's fighting because he seemed to be in a lot of respects, a fairly gentlemanly guy, at least as far as his dealings with people. But there's a dark side of him that's not always so gentlemanly, and Jerry gets into a lot of that stuff. So.
Yeah, he seemed to like to torture and kill animals.
Yeah, he was a big into that. He was. Yeah.
And in fact, when he went to college, he spent a lot more time trying to do that and going out and partying with his classmates rather than paying much attention to his studies. Yep. So he went to Cambridge, and actually we saw Christ College when we went there a few years ago, where he studied, and he was going to be a country parson, but I think he got his degree in it, but I don't think that he really did anything with that because there's on the Beagle actually where he read Lyell's Principles of Geology. And I think when that was sort of like the linchpin that sort of kicked him over into the dark side. So
if you will. But I think the thing, well, I don't know, there's a lot of factors. Obviously his background, his family background, the Beagle, and reading Lyell's Principles of Geology. And Charles Lyell, interestingly enough, Doug and I saw both their tombstones in Westminster Cathedral there, which always troubles you. Two people who basically were out to destroy the Christian worldview are buried in Westminster Cathedral.
In the foundation of the church.
In the foundation of the church.
And
bad idea.
That's a symbol of the problem. And then people like John Knox, who
the founder of it, he's out in the parking lot.
Right. And so there's a lot of things about. The symbols of how that all works, that it sort of makes you wonder where the thing. But I think what the British do is that they like to honor the people who make a difference in Westminster Abbey, whether that's good or bad.
I know, that makes no sense. It's almost like, okay, that's Times Man of the Year. Could be Adolf Hitler or Mother Teresa. This is whoever did the most significance. There is a point for that in a secular place, but in a cathedral or a place that's lauding Christianity and Christian principles, it kind of shows how far they're falling. Well, we go afield there, but Doug, I think the thing for me, I always wondered if it wasn't the death of his daughter Anna that really set him in a free fall. I don't know that it was, but there's been a lot of things written about that that seemed to. That was the other things were the intellectual things. He was already questioning his background, his experiences. But then there's that personal thing that happened with the death of his daughter, and he goes, how can a God who's supposedly benevolent allow his daughter to die at age 10, Well,
here's the thing. We have to establish early in our lives whether or not we're going to follow the Lord, and that is whether the circumstances, it's regardless of the circumstances that occur to you. Are you going to make that decision to follow the way, because there's nothing else, really, so to speak. You have to, in terms of eternity and eternal life, there's a decision that people need to make. Are we going to, because we all know in our heart there is a God. When you ultimately, that's, there's something in us that tells us that there is a God.
I think that void in Darwin is what set him off. I don't know if I could find that. I probably should have underlined the list of illnesses that he started
I think
having.
I got them.
You have it's unbelievable the stuff he went through. He had nausea, vomiting.
Yeah, here it is.
Oh, you got the whole list. Go ahead and read them off.
They included severe depression, insomnia, incapacitating anxiety, fits of hysterical crying, depersonalization, vision alterations, such as seeing spots or other visual hallucinations, malaise, vertigo, shaking, tachycardia, fainting spells, shortness of breath, trembling, nausea, vomiting, dizziness, muscle twitches, spasms and tremors, cramps and colics, bloating and nocturnal flatulence.
I know.
The old fart.
The old fart, yeah.
Headaches, nervous exhaustion, dyspepsia, skin problems, scalp blisters, eczema, tinnitus, and sensations of loss of consciousness and impending death.
Yeah. Tinnitus is actually a ringing in his ears. But the things of his depression, he got so bad he would go out, and when he would be around like a party or had to do a lecture, he'd be in his house. He'd retreat for like days or he was totally out of it for weeks at a time. This is a terrible besetting thing, and you feel bad about him. But you're going. I just wonder, Doug, were some of these spiritually induced? I mean,
that's what Jerry concludes in this, is that if you take a look at the medical conditions and what could be causing them, they all sort of point to like a demonic type of influence or possession that is going on in this.
That's what I kind of wondered. I mean, it's mental, soulish, or spiritual, demonic, and it's one of those things, or both of them combined together. And it's interesting, Doug. You mentioned Wallace a little bit earlier. Was it Alfred Wallace? What's his first name? Alfred Wallace had virtually the same theory as Charles Darwin, but he didn't get it through any explorations on the HMS Beagle or reading Lyell's Principle of Geology. As far as I know, he got it from visions and trances getting in. Was it Africa or where was
I
it?
think it was in Indonesia.
Indonesia, okay. And basically, it was in the tribal things, and he went into these trances, and he's basically was letting the spirits come into him. And this theory of evolution, which is virtually identical to Darwin, that got Darwin so disturbed because he had been sitting on it for like 30 years, really hesitant to publish it, really impelled him or compelled him to finally publish this book. And yet you find, okay, he's lauded as this great scientist, but a guy who was basically demonically inspired or something, trance-like, gets this vision of this theory is virtually identical with Charles Darwin, even so much that many evolutionists acknowledge Wallace as a co-founder or co-creator of evolution today, where most average person have never heard of Wallace.
Well, what it sounds to me like is actually a principality that's probably...
It sounds to me like that.
This whole thing is bigger than just Charles Darwin. It's something that is a stronghold that not only was fed by the times, but it was something that Darwin embraced, and there is a consequence because once you allow something like that into your life, it has these consequences. They don't leave you alone.
No, and Darwin apparently never left him alone, because he started suffering these things. What, Doug? He was in his 30s when he started coming down with some of this stuff, and his entire life was beset by just really horrible. We read the litany of illnesses and ailments and symptoms that he suffered throughout his entire life. But his depression was one of the worst. Oh, yeah. He would go through these fits and these bouts of depression. He was so upset he couldn't even deal with people for days. And it was funny, his wife Emma, who was a Unitarian, which was more of a, the authority of Scripture back in those days. I don't know what they are. Unitarians now, I don't think they're so good now. I think they're a cult now.
Yeah,
but back in the day,
yeah.
they were pretty much very orthodox. In fact, they would
This
be.
was before they merged with the Universalists. So.
Is that what happened? They merged with the Universal. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, they went in the tank. But back in time when Emma Darwin was in that church, or Emma Wedgwood was her maiden name. Unitarians were quite orthodox. They'd almost be called the fundamentalists of today, I would guess. You know.
Yeah, well, they were also Anglican.
Yes, there was that too. Yes.
And so there was a lot of that type of influence, from Emma, and from what Jerry's research on Emma was that she wrote a couple of creationist books, and so she pretty much opposed what Charles was doing, yet loved him.
Loved him and loved him enough, Doug. She helped him with his manuscripts, helped him promote his. I really don't understand Emma Darwin really quite a lot. I don't. I mean, I guess love does make strange bedfellows. In this case, literally.
And this particular thing is sort of hard to figure out. Well, and I'd like to get into the mind of Emma Darwin and find out. Well, how did you do this? You're a saint to live this character.
Well, I think part of her maybe her wifely and matronly or feminine empathy come for his sufferings. Probably played a big factor.
Times
as well.
back then, I think, also was more conducive for people sticking together. Whereas, I think that if you had something like that today.
Well, it's true too, and I think also when she was married, when Charles asked her, she was probably kind of worried. Jerry brings that up in his book that she might have been kind of worried being a spinster.
Right,
She was getting a little. Although to us it's not old, but in those days she was like, I don't know, pushing 30, maybe, and that's like that was ancient back in those days, and not to be married, oh boy. So, but I mean, saying all that, I think she truly loved Charles Darwin. I think truly Charles Darwin loved her. But the thing about it, Doug, there are things about Darwin. We talked about his kind of cruelty to animals. Okay, we're not saying if you hunt animals you're cruel. But he did more than that, He took great glee in some of the stuff like that. But there were other things about Darwin that were precipitated, and Jerry has brought up in other books of his. People talk about, well, for instance, social Darwinism. Let's get into that a little bit, Social Darwinism is the idea that certain races are superior to other races, or conversely, certain races are inferior to other races. A sexism, the same kind of thing, the idea that women are inferior to men.
And Darwin wrote about that.
And Darwin wrote about that. You want to talk about that?
Both of those things.
Both of those things, yes.
And he wrote, first of all, his subtitle for his book is "A Preservation of Races."
The superior races, I think is what it was. Yeah, Origin of the Species. For the preservation of the superior races or favored races, whatever. Yeah.
And so,
which made superior in those days.
I should actually pull out the book and.
Yeah, we have it right here somewhere. I don't know where it is. Yeah, but that's basically it. Was a subtitle. But yeah, and you can say, well, he's meaning it in a certain way. But you read some of Darwin's writings, of Doug, and Jerry brings a lot of those up. In some of the stuff he wrote about, it was really much. We know his bulldog, Thomas Huxley. Basically, he talked about the Negro as the missing link between the gorilla and the Teuton, which are Teutonic races, Germanic races. The whole idea of Hitlerian type of ideas from Nietzsche and Ernst Haeckel and all those guys are really pretty consistent with Darwinian thinking.
And it's taking Darwinism to its ultimate end,
And its logical end.
And a lot of that sort of stuff still survives today. We just had a missionary from the Congo talk about his experiences where people would not reach out to the pygmies because they didn't think that they were human. And and so he has part of his ministry to reach out to people groups of that sort, and they respond to the gospel just like anybody else. But there's a mentality that if someone is a little bit different, that they may not be human or may not have a soul or they're not worth reaching. Or
well, Doug, if you get the idea that if you got certain races of people develop from a certain kind of a gorilla or ape-like hominid, if you will, or you got the Christian viewpoint that says we're all descended from one blood, which would mean Adam and Eve, okay, and through him then Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. We're all descended from a common ancestor, but it's not an amoeba. It's a human being, okay? Darwinian Thinking says, oh, everything come upward, but they make common ancestors, but it's amazing how they differentiate when it comes to the races. Now, since the Hitler and eugenics things came under a lot of disrepute, they've distanced themselves now. But the fact of the matter is, this was considered absolutely reasonable, and Darwin himself promoted it. Okay.
That's right. His cousin Francis Galton also was.
Oh yeah. There's a piece of work.
Yeah, he went to those types of extremes, and he was probably a founder of the eugenics movement. Here's a quote that we're talking about Darwin's attitude towards women. He said, Darwin introduced this discussion of psychology and descent of man by reasserting his commitment to the principle of continuity, and Darwin rested his case on a judicious blend of zoomorphic and anthropomorphic arguments. Savages were said to possess smaller brains and more prehensile limbs than the higher races, and whose lives were said to be dominated more by instinct and less by reason, were placed in the intermediate position between nature and man. And Darwin extended this placement by analogy to include not only children and congenital idiots, but also women, some of whose powers of intuition by rapid perception and imitation were characteristics of the lower races, therefore of a past and lower stage of civilization.
Oh man.
So he's saying that the women are less civilized.
Yeah, women are lower. Well, he I don't know if it was Darwin. I thought it was Darwin. I can't prove it because I don't think Jerry mentioned this, but I read a quote years ago, and it's the idea that women were inferior. Their facial features were less developed than men were.
Yeah.
They were not as, you could tell their intelligence was not as far developed because their character was not as fully developed as they were in men. I mean, that's unbelievable stuff that's written. You could never get away with that today. Yet he himself is lauded as a paragon of not only virtue but as of a scientific person you want to be. The other thing to do is some of the, like I say, but he plagiarized people. Yeah. He had dark fits, which seemed to be almost brought on. The theories were like, many were an amalgam of a lot of things.
And he did some quack experimentation.
He did some bad experiment. That's the other thing. You want to talk about that, Doug?
You know, some of the things, he did a whole piece of work on emotions.
Yes.
And he fabricated some of the emotions by having his victims or his people photographed subjected to shock treatment.
Oh, he had electrodes in there. Then he would get the electrodes taken out when when he put it in his book.
And so he would doctor the photographs.
Yeah.
And so that type of research really typifies.
Well, a lot of also some of Darwin's ideas have been discredited, but he has held on to, which happens a lot with, I would consider, almost all evolutionary stuff. They get rid of something, they substitute with something else, but they keep the basic premise. The idea of pangenesis,
right.
The idea of Lamarckianism, which he incorporates a lot in his theories, have all been absolutely discredited.
Though they've been discredited, evolution needs Lamarckianism because there's really no other explanation. It's the idea that the giraffe's neck gets longer and longer as it.
I remember reading that when I was a kid.
Right.
In Catholic school, they were promoting that. You could stretch your neck out. The giraffes got their neck longer they wanted to reach the top leaves, and over generations. We know that's bogus.
We know it's true.
So bad. Really, but that was part of Darwin's thinking.
And it's that impression that people are left with that is so deceptive. Though that they we know that scientifically it doesn't work.
No.
Because they want it so bad to work, and they need it to promote their theory. They sort of like sneak it in, you know.
Well, the other thing, Doug, is they also have to have spontaneous generation.
That's right.
Because this is not a theory like evolution is called a theory. It is a law, okay? If evolution was so well proven, it should be a law by now. And it's not a law, it's a theory, and I think it's not even that. I think it's more of an hypothesis, okay? But the law of biogenesis said life always comes from life. So you have to explain the uncaused first cause or an evolutionary scenario even to happen. And of course, that begs the question, he started with Lyell's principle of geology because it gave him the time he needed, because no one's ever seen macroevolution happen. No one's ever seen something go from non-living things to living things, go from simple to complex. All they've seen is stuff vary from what is, or get simpler or less genetically rich, if you will. You know?
It'd be interesting to see if you could sort of like trace the origin of this principality or this demonic influence. I think it starts with Lyell, and actually those that came before Voltaire. And those,
it was around that time when it really got bad. There was a couple of people earlier, but yeah, that was about that late 1700s. But some of it goes back as early as even the late 1600s. You'd be a couple of smatterings, but in the late 1700s, man, it was bad news. Really, it all kind of everything hit the fan, you know. But
and a lot of it was divine right of kings and things of that sort.
Pick up this book, though. This is really called The Dark Side of Charles Darwin. It is copiously footnoted. Jerry is an indefatigable researcher and a phenomenal, you can look up all the books in there. The Dark Side of Charles Darwin, A Critical Analysis of an Icon of Science by Jerry Bergman. Pick it up. It's really good.
We'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.